than us. And what we're going to read, the passage we're going to get into tonight, he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must. Must. These are requirements for being my disciple, and he's going to lay it out for us. And he doesn't hold back. He's going to tell us the truth about what being his disciple requires. Now, before we get there, let me see a raise of hands of who wants to be Jesus' disciple. Okay, about somewhere between 95 and 100%. Most of us want that. And I think Jesus wants us to be his disciples too. Like, that's something he wants us to have. So when we look at these requirements, we would expect them to be somewhat simple, easy, and awesome. And so if you're taking notes, I'm going to give them to you real quick. Number one is to eat ice cream. But we're like, Jesus, how often? And does it matter what kind? I mean, those are questions that we got to ask. Number two is to make a post on Twitter. And again, like, how often are we supposed to do that? And can it be any post? Right? Can it say cuss words in it? Or it doesn't need to be a good post. And number three is to sleep in. The requirements of discipleship, and we don't need to ask questions about that. We'll just, all right, Jesus. All right, maybe they're not that easy, but they are equally awesome. So here's the real three. Number one is to see God's not dead, every single one of them. When one comes out, you got to see it. The second one, and this is just pure luck, is to listen to oceans once a day, every day. Require discipleship. And number three is to never miss an Easter service. Of course, you wouldn't do that. That's being his disciple. All right. How about the real ones? Number one, you must read the word every day. Number two, you have to be at every church service that your church offers. And number three, you have to serve and love God's creation in every single situation. Raise your hand if you're fulfilling that. So we all want to be Jesus' disciples, but we seem to be falling short on some of these lists. Maybe the first list, we had a few that were meeting those requirements. What if I told you the actual requirements? If you wrote those down, those are, again, not what we're going to be reading tonight. What if I told you that the actual requirements of being a disciple of Jesus were even more extreme than these? When all of us aren't even living up to these standards, and his is even more extreme for being his disciple, are we making anybody nervous? Jesus greater than me. How about instead of me making up lists, we actually read what he has to say about it? Y'all down with that? If you'll turn to Luke 9, we're going to see what Jesus has to say about being his disciple. Give you a second. It'll be verse 23 is where we're going to start. You might recognize Luke 9:23. Okay. Starting Luke 9:23, then he said to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Are you pumped for the actual requirements of being Jesus' disciple? Excitement? We're pumped. They're equally delicious to ice cream. Number one, deny themselves. You getting excited? You wake up in the morning, you're like, denial. That's what I want, and I like it. Number 2, to take up their cross daily. Ooh. The thing that they use to kill people, I'll take a side of that. Number 3, follow me. That doesn't seem too difficult as long as where we're going is not that hard. It wouldn't take a long time to memorize these, really. Whoever wants to be my disciple must, number 1, deny themselves. And number 2, take up their cross daily. Number 3, follow me. Y'all think you can do that with me? Whoever wants to be my disciple must, number 1, deny themselves. Number 2, take up their cross daily. Number 3, follow me. The majority of the world's people would agree that God is greater than us. He is above us. He knows more than us. He's more powerful than us. But the question is not, is God greater, but is he greater in us than us? Not do we recognize that Jesus has glory, that he's sovereign, but is he actually greater in us? Is it true for our lives that because Jesus is greater, Jesus is greater? We want to study these more in depth. The first 3 that he lays out, and we'll throw in a couple at the end. But before we get into it, I want to point out what Jesus says just before he gives these musts of a disciple. Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection before that, he asked Peter, who do you say I am? And he steps up to the plate. You're the anointed one. Maybe your version says Messiah or Christ. They all mean the exact same thing. And that's awesome because Peter gets the question right. But likely, like Peter with the rest of the Israelite people, they had this understanding of the Messiah that wasn't going to be what Jesus was going to be. He was this military force. He was going to free them from the Roman people. And so Peter may be having this in mind when thinking of the Messiah. How does Jesus respond? He responds with what kind of Messiah he's actually going to be. One that before he reigns must suffer. Read it with me in verse 22. 9:22, and he said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed on the 3rd day, be raised to life." His death and resurrection. And it goes in the face of everything the Jews had believed up to that point about what the Messiah was going to be. He says, suffer many things, rejected by the people that were leading, those that he was supposed to lead with away from the Roman people, that he would be killed. In his requirements of disciples, he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must. Did you notice that before those requirements, when he's talking about what he's going to do, he says the Son of Man must. Before he gives the requirements of disciples, he gives his own requirements of what he must do in order to save mankind. He said he must suffer many things. He must be killed. He's laid out what he has to do before he lays out what the disciples must do, and they're really very similar. Disciples must deny themselves. They must take up their cross, and they must follow Jesus, follow God. Well, for Jesus, we read of him in the Garden of Gethsemane. What does he have to do? He has to absolutely deny himself. Scared about what is coming. He has to literally take up a cross. And he has to make the conscious choice to follow the will of God. There's two awesome truths here that I want us to know as we get into Luke 23 through 26. And number one is that Jesus does not call us to things that he has not already done. And our disciple requirements, he doesn't call us to anything that he hasn't already displayed and given for us. Denying himself, picking up his cross in a literal way, following the will of God. And number two, Jesus being who he is, he never asks us to do anything arbitrary. And maybe that's a big word, but he never has us do anything that doesn't mean something, that doesn't have purpose, simply because of who he is. Anything that he would require of us to do to follow him is out of necessity, not something that he simply made up. We know that he's good. So let's try to understand what these mean. The disciple requirements, read 23 with me one more time. Then he said to them, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. Whoever wants to be my disciple, the literal Greek here is whoever wants to come after me. Whoever wants to pursue Jesus, this is what you have to do. And the first one is that I have to deny myself. If you're writing that down, put a hyphen, a dash in between my and self. What we normally think of when it comes to denying self is like, I really want that second strawberry shortcake. I want it. But look, I'm going to deny myself, and I'm just going to eat half of the second one. I'm going to have 1.5 strawberry shortcakes, and I'm going to deny myself for Jesus. Okay? That's what I'm going to do. This is self-denial. In a more real way, part of what Jesus is getting at here with self-denial is to deny what I want. That's a part of it. To put away those evil desires, choose to obey Jesus instead. Jesus is greater than sin. And for a long time, that's what I thought he was talking about alone right here. I want to deny my desires, and I want to pick up what Jesus has for me instead. There's probably a little bit more here. A little bit deeper, and a popular biblical story will help us in this, I think. You guys remember Peter? You remember him doing something 3 times when Jesus was arrested? You have an idea? What was that? He denied Jesus. We're talking about denying self. When Peter was questioned by people, don't you know this guy? Aren't you from Galilee? He said, no, I don't know that man. I don't know that man. I think the deeper part that Jesus is getting at here is that type of style with ourselves. I don't know that man. I don't know that woman. And before you're like, what in the world are we talking about? How do you not know yourself? Denying self is not just denying desires. That's a part of it. But we are not our desires. And if I could just speak some truth real quick to us tonight, the world is yelling at us. You are what you want. Those go hand in hand. Whatever you desire, that is who you are. But that is false. That is a lie. We are more than our desires, good or bad. We get to choose to ask God to help us change desires if that's what needs to take place, or we have a choice to follow them or not to follow them. We are not slaves to what we want. We have a choice, we have a say in the matter. And so the second part of this, first is denying our desires, but to actually deny my very self. To start to move to a place where I'm focused, I'm focused on myself less and less. Later in chapter 9, if you look with me, I think Jesus helps us understand what he may mean by this. So the disciples always understood Jesus' teaching like right off the bat, put it into use immediately. So naturally, a little bit later in this chapter, they're arguing about who's the greatest. And Jesus is like, what are you guys doing? He brings a child and stands beside him. In verse 48 of chapter 9, then he said to them, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And listen to this. For it is the one who is least among you all who is the greatest. To spend our lives welcoming and loving and serving people is to forget ourselves and to deny ourselves. Where we aren't doing good for fanfare and people to notice, but we genuinely love God, and so we love people, and we serve them, and we welcome them. As we forget ourselves, others become greater, and we see their need. In Jesus' eyes, whoever denies themselves the best is the greatest. The second requirement is to take up my cross every day. Take up my cross every day. If you know the story of Jesus, you recognize this. When criminals were being led to crucifixion by the Romans, they would often carry a piece or their own cross to where they were going to be put to death. Their choices in life, whether it was murder, however they broke the law, their choices led to the consequence of taking up their cross to the place that they were going to die. Their choices led them to that place. And the disciples, very similar in what Jesus is comparing here, is that because of the choice that we make, you raise your hand, I want to be a disciple of Jesus. Because of that choice, there's going to be crosses that we bear. Because of the choice we make to follow Jesus and be his disciples, there's going to be things on us that we have to take up on a daily basis and carry with us. And for different people, it's going to be different things. Not too long ago, when we had a group at Falls Creek, we learned about, I think it was 37 Egyptian believers who were murdered for their faith in Jesus. That is a cross to bear that they chose in following Jesus. For some of us, it may be rejection in the workplace because we won't do something unethical. It may be rejection in a relationship because we won't be sexually involved before marriage. And choosing to be Jesus' disciple, there is crosses that we will have to bear. And being willing to endure anything. Your life may not be required of you in this, but if it was, would we be willing? We don't get a day off either. Every day. Take up my cross every single day. And this is so extreme. These requirements to deny self, to take up this crazy cross. I mean, you can't come to any other conclusion. But for someone to be Jesus' disciple, they have to seriously understand Jesus' love. Like crazy get what Jesus has done in order to follow through in this way. Not any kind of like handed down Christianity from parents, or one that puts religion over Jesus and is just trying to be good for people to see, because when push comes to shove, this is going to be too much for that person. Jesus had this crazy way of thinning the herd. In John 6, which is also recorded in Luke 9 that we're studying tonight, Jesus feeds 5,000 people. You've heard the story, popular story. In John 6, the next morning, Jesus and his disciples have left. And they're like, where's this guy at? And so they kind of chase him down. They cross the sea and they find Jesus again. And they're like, hey man, what's the deal? It's morning, we're hungry again. Jesus says, how about you believe in me? I'm the bread of life. And they say, well, why don't you show us a sign, like by giving us food again, that you are who you say you are? And things are going so good for Jesus. Like, the crowd is huge. He's extremely popular. Can you just feed him, Jesus, and keep this going? Instead, he starts getting weird. He says, I'm the bread of life. Eat me. And they're like, what? Yeah, eat my flesh and drink my blood. At the end of chapter 6, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? In John 6:66, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. There was so many wanting him so bad, coming after him, crossing a sea to get to him. They admired him. What was the problem? They were not who Jesus was looking for. People that just wanted him for what he could give them. They weren't disciples. Not in the requirements he gives in Luke 9. I have two hopes tonight. The first is that we would never reach this point that these disciples did, where they say, this is too much, Jesus. This is too weird. I hope that in this life that we realize that the faith that saves is lasting faith. Perseverance of the saints. And we never come to the point where this is too much, Jesus. The cost is too great. That's my first hope. And the second is that we wouldn't have this thought that discipleship or following Jesus is so easy because we're not actually doing it. And please hear me. I don't want you to give up because it doesn't seem worth it. The church reminds us that it is. But number two, I don't want you to be half following Jesus, not denying self, not taking up cross, not really follow him, and just think this isn't really that hard. Because both of those, the one that turns away when it seems too hard, and the one where it's just really too simple, it's too easy, there doesn't seem to be this denial of taking up, both of those people are not Jesus' disciples. Both don't have a relationship with him. And we can decide even tonight to be people who are his true disciples, that deny our very self, that take up a cross, whatever that may be, because we know that Jesus is worth it. The third requirement, I'll finish up with these last three quick. It's pretty simple. Follow Jesus. For the disciples, that was a physical following. For us now, that is a spiritual following. I follow Jesus. And this makes sense because if I'm denying myself and I'm forgetting myself, I got to put my attention somewhere. Have you ever stopped a habit and didn't really replace it with anything and then went back to that habit? Or you found a new habit that wasn't good as well and spent time there. As we rid ourselves of ourselves, Jesus takes full picture. And if I'm carrying a cross, I'm carrying it for someone, and it's Jesus. If I'm getting rid of myself, I'm bringing up someone else, and it's Jesus. We follow a person, never an idea that sounds cool. We're not following a religion. We're following God, a personal being. Someone that can be greater in our lives. Not following our next meal, not following a fairy tale that our parents told us, but a real person, Jesus. Don't forget that we follow him and nothing else. Read verse 24 with me real quick. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. And my initial thought in this is, doesn't everyone want to save their life? That's a normal desire to have. The way William Barclay puts it here in helping us understand it. A man must spend his life, not hoard it. Our fourth requirement is to lose my life for Jesus. We're given life to use it for him. Not just for us to enjoy. Not just for us to spend our lives on our own lives and then die at the end. If you think of your life as money that you have to spend, where is it going? What's the end goal of the time, the effort, the love that you've been given by God? Where is that being spent? Because once we've used it up, the time and the effort and love that we have, there's no more to give. It ends. Our lives end. Are we spending our lives on ourselves, on saving ourselves, on our own life, or are we losing our lives for Jesus? And in doing so, allowing him to save and fulfill our lives. In doing this, we forego what the world can provide us, and we choose to be provided for by God. In 25, Jesus questions this type of thought. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very soul? If we spend and we focus on our lives, for our lives, we can gain a heck of a lot. Money and prestige, a good-looking family, a nice car, and a nice house. But he's saying, what good is that to you in the end? Where is that stuff going to be when it's said and done? It's going to be gone. Why shoot for that and forfeit your very souls? In denying ourselves, we save our very selves, but in focusing on ourselves, we forfeit ourselves. The thing we come to is that we either deny ourselves or we deny Jesus. There isn't like a middle ground. There's not really an alternative choice. It's deny me or deny him. We can't both be greater. Either he is or I am. That's an exclusive status. The cost of following Jesus is heavy, but the cost of not following him is so much greater. In 26, look what he says. Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory and in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. To be ashamed of Jesus is to have him be ashamed of us to be face to face with God, and Jesus turned his head the other way. Man. The last requirement is loyalty to Jesus. When we're together, it's pretty easy to love God and to praise him with our songs. But he's called us to be his disciple in every situation and in every place. When we leave here to continue to follow him with all that we are, loyalty is still required of us. You feel beat up, like there's no way I could possibly do this? We're absolutely right in thinking that. This is more than we could ever hope to accomplish. The only way someone can be a disciple of Jesus is to trust him like crazy. Because denying self is hard. And taking up a cross is hard. Only to continue to believe that what Jesus is bringing us and rewarding us with in salvation, that is worth it, can we possibly be his disciples and continue to be his disciples. When I was working on my undergraduate degree, we learned of a theory called the social exchange theory. And it's really more simple than it sounds. In a relationship, if it costs me more than it's getting me, I'm going to probably cut ties with that relationship. But if in my view, the rewards are outweighing the costs, I'm going to stay with that relationship. Or I'm going to increase that relationship. In order to be Jesus' true disciple, which is his only disciple, we have to continually remind ourselves that he is worth it. That the reward is worth it in the end. That's why he made this. That's why we have the church. That's why following Jesus is not a one-on-one thing, but we have our relationship with him, and we have others encouraging us and reminding us towards him. Trust him ridiculously. Why don't y'all bow your heads, close your eyes. In John 3, John the Baptist is baptizing people, and his disciples come to him and say, Jesus is baptizing, and more are going to him. What are we going to do about this? And John says an amazing thing. He says, he must become greater. I must become less. What if each day Jesus became greater in us and we became a little bit less? I think he said it the way he did on purpose. That Jesus first becomes greater and greater, and naturally we become less and less, and denying ourselves starts to be a way of life. As we remember his promises, our crosses pale in comparison to the blessings and rewards. I'm going to pray, and then you just take some time in prayer, whatever you need to talk to God about. Now's the time to do so. God, thank you for your word, and that we can be your disciples and love you. The thing we asked in our song is pretty extreme, and help us to recognize it. That Spirit, we want you to lead us where our trust is without fail. We want your Spirit to lead us without borders. Being your actual disciple that denies ourselves, takes up our cross, and follows you is going to take boundless trust. Right now, point out whatever you need to in our lives. Thank you for tonight.